The coronavirus pandemic has changed the way we live our lives. Nearly every country in the world has been affected. Millions of infections, hundreds of thousands of deaths. And while scientists work on developing a vaccine, governments are focusing on reducing the number of infections through social distancing and other preventative measures. But these restrictions have brought with them countless financial losses across the globe. The coronavirus recession is considered to be the worst economic downturn since the 1929 Great Depression. I'm Rochelle Carey in Doha. As COVID-19 measures halt international trade, shut down airports, and bankrupt businesses, tens of millions of people have lost their jobs. And for many, being unemployed in the middle of a pandemic means not only losing their income, but it also means losing access to health care. So how can governments protect their workers and rebuild their economies? The Director General of the International Labor Organization, Guy Ryder, talks to Al Jazeera. Mr. Guy Ryder, Director General of the International Labor Organization, thank you so much for your time. It has been said that we are all in this together, but we are not. This pandemic does not affect everyone the same. As economies started to shut down country after country after country, what was your immediate thought about what this would mean for workers, for laborers?
Well, I think you're absolutely right in what you say. We are all in this together, but some of us are in it up to our necks and others a bit less so. My immediate worry, of course, was how on earth, as we take the necessary measures, and I underline the word necessary, measures to counter the virus and close down large parts of the world of work, how are people going to get through this? How are people who don't have big reserves, don't have a lot of money behind them, who rely on their work every day to make a living, how are they going to get through this? And, I think as the crisis has deepened and the loss of employment has become dramatic, those worries are now very much with us today. These are the questions that we need to confront right now.
There are millions of people in the richest country in the world, in the U.S., that are out of jobs. There are thousands and thousands of them that are waiting in line for food. If that is the state of things in the richest country in the world, what does that say to you about how things are in other countries?
Right, so let's look at the global picture. We estimate that in the second quarter of the year, the loss of jobs calculated on the reduction of working time is equivalent to the loss of 305 million jobs around the world. And that is affecting all regions. Now, in some countries, people are being protected at least to an acceptable degree. There are job retention schemes, there are social protection mechanisms which are keeping people's incomes up. But as you've quite rightly pointed out, even in the richest countries of the world, some people are falling through the cracks. We see people going to the food banks, we see them going to the soup kitchens. And then if you look at the developing world and the emerging economies where, the virus hasn't struck quite as strongly yet in many cases as we might have feared. Nevertheless, in that informal economy where, let's not forget, 6 out of 10 people make a living, we're now seeing people really in a situation of utter destitution. We estimate that 1.6 billion informal workers around the world are now suffering a very major impact on their livelihoods. These are people who live day to day from their daily earnings. And those daily earnings, on average in the world, have taken a hit of 60% in the first month of the pandemic. So we do face a situation of potential humanitarian catastrophe.
So when you talk about the informal economy, that is a significant portion of economies in a lot of countries. I mean, some Central American countries, South Africa, other African countries. What types of vulnerabilities do people that are part of that particular segment face?
Yeah, I mean, the informal economy predominates in many countries in the world, behind that global average of about 60% informality. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa, Southern Asia, you can get up to 80, 90%. In Latin America in general, 50%. And the point about these people is, in the first instance, they operate outside any coverage of labour legislation and without any really adequate notion of social protection. So if they're off work, there's no money coming in. If they get sick, they often don't have the chance to have access to healthcare. And so, in the most extreme cases, what the close downs are doing in reaction to the pandemic are placing people almost in front of this impossible dilemma. Either they go out to work in dangerous conditions to earn themselves a day's wage, or they sit at home, but there's no money coming in and there's no food on the table. And I've heard many people say in these conditions that the choice becomes dying because of the virus or dying of hunger. Now, one doesn't want to overstate it, but the solution here has to be getting much needed assistance. And here I'm talking about the basics of survival to these people so that they can get through this pandemic. These are the real vulnerabilities, and I would perhaps underline just how many women workers depend on the informal economy for their livelihoods. So these are really very stark realities, and it's happening right now.
So the governments that want to get a handle on the coronavirus, looking out for these workers is part of that, is it not? Because of what you just said, you don't want to put these people in a position where just to feed their children, they're going to take a risk, which may end up, in fact, spreading the pandemic. So don't those two things go together? Do governments see that?
Yeah, I think governments do see that they have these double responsibilities to protect the population at large and the workers themselves from the virus, but then seeing them through this in terms of their economic and social well-being. So I've no doubt that governments understand this very well. I think the drama that we face is that those countries where informality is high and therefore where this dilemma is felt most acutely, they're precisely the countries which have the least resources and capacities to juggle these two balls in the air at the same time. And some are making very commendable efforts, but I think there's only one solution, or there's only one answer to this calculation, and that is that we need to help these countries internationally. They can't manage on their own in many cases, and they therefore need the resources and assistance to get them through this. And I think that necessarily must make us focus on one of the disappointing, let me put it no more strongly than that, features of the handling of this crisis. There's been a lack of international cooperation. The appetite for multilateral cooperation of common purpose has not been there, or it's not been there in sufficient quantity.
The money is there, that the money is there. Are you saying it's a matter of the will to get it to where it needs to be?
Well, look, is the money there or not? What we see is different countries, different governments around the world throwing a lot of cash, a lot of resources at keeping their own economies going, at protecting their own populations. And that's fully understandable. When the G20 leaders had a summit in March, they talked about the mobilization of $5 trillion to face the pandemic down. That's a lot of money, but it was being spent by governments in their own countries. This is simply the addition of national level interventions. What is not happening is this transfer of resources to those countries which are really short of them. And that is where I think the global solidarity level is below what it needs to be.
Let me ask you this. Is some of that because of a lack of a global leader? I mean, in previous times, it would have seemed that the U.S. would fill in that gap and be the one to really set that type of agenda. And just factually speaking, that's actually not what's happening. How do you think that's damaging?
Well, I'm old enough to have lived through the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And you might recall that was when the G20 was set up. And there really was a common purpose to avoid the worst happening, total financial collapse, which was really on the cards at the beginning of 2009. And, with all of the pain that we went through in that crisis, there was an international mobilization. The worst was avoided. And the global leaders of the day came together and made it happen. Now, I don't think I'm saying anything controversial or particularly new when I say that the commitment to multilateral cooperation, to this type of international action, today, for political reasons, is a great deal less than it was that 12 or so years ago. And yes, this is affecting our capacity to help people to get through this pandemic. I think this is self-evident.
Let's talk about the responsibility of countries. There has been criticism that in the Gulf, that in the U.S. and certain other countries are actually knowingly deporting workers that they know are sick. Can you talk about what the responsibility is there for countries, for people that are, for governments, for people that are in their country?
Actually, you asked me earlier on about the vulnerabilities of people facing this pandemic. One group of workers who are particularly vulnerable are, of course, migrant workers around the world, and they're present in most of our societies. My principled position would be that we should not treat migrant workers any different from any other workers. They're entitled to have their livelihoods protected. They're entitled to have their health protected. But we know that in some cases, some instances, migrant workers do not enjoy that sort of equality of treatment. And I think there are two things. If we perceive that migrant workers' populations are a problem in this pandemic, either because their labour is no longer needed, or because they constitute a health threat, these people can't simply be treated as disposable. They can't simply be put out to the border. They can't be left to their own devices. And we've seen in several countries as well that migrants often live physically in dormitory situations, in quite densely crowded circumstances.
And that makes social distancing impossible.
Which makes social distancing impossible simply by virtue of how and where they live. And governments really have a responsibility to these workers to sort these problems out. But not only that, migrant workers' dormitories can become a centre for infection for others as well. So there is a common enlightened interest here. Looking after migrant workers properly will also look after the local populations as well. This is really easy for me to say. I think in practical terms, either because of political will or the practical circumstances of these workers, some governments are finding it difficult to act on these principles. But they really have to, as a matter of humanity and as a matter of self-interest for their own populations.
Are these particular communities that we're talking about, migrant workers, how difficult, how challenging is it to get accurate information to them? I mean, we already know that there are various myths, lies, misinformation floating out there around all levels of education, people that are believing conspiracy theories and bad information that's just not true. How important, how difficult is it to get those most vulnerable communities the information that they actually need? This is a really scary time.
You're right. There's a lot of misinformation out there, isn't there? And I think it's a time when we need to get correct and needed information to migrant populations themselves. And I would say equally important, local populations need to be properly informed about the circumstances of migrant workers. It is remarkable, isn't it, when you look at those frontline workers in this pandemic, the 170 million workers who work in healthcare and social care around the world. Just how many of those workers are migrant workers? And this is the real story about migration. This is a real story about people, often in pretty difficult circumstances, contributing extraordinarily, sometimes heroically, to our societies. And yet, public perceptions often tend to be much more negative than that. I think the challenge for us all is to confront prejudice with facts. And then we'll see the facts show that migration is really a positive phenomenon for us all, and that these migrant workers are deserving of our concern and our protection as much as anybody else.
So basically a challenge to rethink the term essential worker. If you think someone is an essential worker, then treat them as such.
I think you're absolutely right. We have redefined our notion of essential workers over the last month or two. Who would have thought, I think into my own mind here, that we would regard the bus driver, the supermarket cashier, the social care worker as the people who really keep our economies and our societies going. That's a realization that we have today. But the fact of the matter is, and I would reiterate that 70% of these workers are women, many of them are migrants. In normal circumstances, these workers are on minimum pay, if that at best. They are undervalued workers. We really don't give them the regard, we don't value them at their true level of contribution to our societies. The question I have in my mind is, once we get out of this problem and once their extraordinary contribution in confronting this pandemic sort of recedes into our memories, how are we going to treat these people? How are we going to pay them? How are we going to look at their conditions of work? Is this going to make a lasting impression and lead to a change of our mindsets in respect of these workers? And I don't hesitate to tell you that I hope that it will have a lasting impact. We shouldn't fall back, I think, into our, frankly, inadequate treatment of these people, which has characterized their situation up to now.
So basically, an opportunity, for lack of a better word, to rethink the social contract that we have with people that we depend on.
Well, I really think that is the case. Even before this pandemic hit, in the face of growing inequalities and injustices, certainly in the world of work, and we've seen this growing inequality for decades now, there was a pretty widespread feeling that somehow the social contract had either sort of been put aside or it had been broken. People were thinking in these terms already. And if the one thing that the pandemic might do us a favor with, it would actually put into focus ideas of what is fair in our society, a wake-up call to insert a degree of fairness, just basic decency in the way that people are treated at work. And yes, I hope that will happen.
There have been various relief packages in various countries to do. Some are companies that can apply to get money to pay for their workers or to keep their businesses open over a certain period of time. And those aren't necessarily the same thing. Keeping the business open isn't necessarily the same thing as keeping your workers. Are you finding that there are certain situations where big businesses are, for lack of a better term, bigfooting, really, relief efforts that are really supposed to keep the least among us employed?
Yeah, well, let me sort of start by saying that we have been encouraging and pleased to see that in many countries which have the means to do so, governments have been investing heavily in job retention scheme, furloughing processes, and also trying to keep businesses alive during this pandemic. There's good reasons for this because, the extent to which otherwise viable companies can survive the rigors of the pandemic and the extent to which we can retain workers in their companies, even if they're not working today, if they remain attached to their company, to the extent we can do that, the recovery will be that much better, that much smoother, and people will be helped to get through the rigors of the situation. But what I think you're pointing to, and I think you're right to do so, is what sort of conditions should be attached to support to enterprises. And this is I think, very important element of the public debate. Is it reasonable to sort of hand out cash to keep any company going, small or big? I think many people sympathize with the situations of small and medium-sized enterprises, many of which don't have the reserves to last for a matter of weeks if they've got no income. And then you've got the big players, the household name multinationals. And I think we're still working our way through that debate. And, in the debates that I see, people are saying, yeah, well, we really need to look at the behavior of companies in terms of dividend payments, in terms of their executive remuneration packages, their tax policies. Are they putting into national treasuries what they're now seeking to take out of national treasuries? And again, I think we come back to this notion of social contract. What's fair? What's the give and take of the way we organize our world of work vis-a-vis employers and working people? And I think these debates are going to be with us, by the way, for some time, particularly when the bill is presented for everything that's been done to get us through this pandemic.
You've twice specifically mentioned women, and I'm glad you have. Can you talk a little bit more about the potential, the realities of how women are often exploited at the lowest of times like this?
Women are highly concentrated in low value and informal employment in the world. So when I've talked about the impact of the pandemic on informal workers, there are 2 billion informal workers in the world. Very large numbers of those are women, and they're often in the most difficult, the most precarious parts of the informal economy. At the same time, where the pandemic has forced us to focus on care in society, what do we see? That the primary care providers are women, sometimes in paid settings, more often in unpaid settings. And this is the double burden on women. Often when they're in the world of work, they do undervalued paid work. but they're also suffering from the fact that they take on an undue burden of unpaid care responsibilities. So women have all of these disadvantages. And at the same time, there is straightforward discrimination. We know that the gender pay gap in the world is around 18 to 20%, so that for every dollar a man earns, a woman for doing exactly the same job or equivalent thereof gets 80 cents. So women have been and continue to be massively disadvantaged at work. They're on the sharp end of the effects of this pandemic. And it's a bit like what we said about the social contract. This pandemic, I think, will again put on the table the questions of how we want to resolve these basic injustices at work. They've been with us for decades, centuries. They don't have to be with us for decades and centuries in the future.
Guy, even during the best of times, not enough people have access to health care, be that in poorer countries or even in the United States. There's not enough access to sick care, not enough access to health care. How concerned are you about a collective trauma that some people are dealing with, and what resources they will have as we try to deal with this and come out of the other side of it?
The pandemic, again, and it's obviously why this should be the case, has shown us just how much we have underinvested in basic health care. Around the world, only about 25% of workers have access to anything approaching comprehensive social protection. So that means actually just getting sick or having a health condition is a drama for the great majority of people in the world. There's no way through it for many of them. And for all of us, we must understand that this is an unacceptable condition. But look at the situations that have appeared in the United States, in my own country. If a worker does not have access to sick pay and they're asked to isolate themselves from their workplace, they simply won't do it. They'll go to work sick because they need the money. And that constitutes a health threat for everybody in society. So once again, in these circumstances of pandemic, we have to go back to some very basic things. It has been an ambition, it has been a social goal of our societies to make sure that everybody can have access to healthcare in our societies. And by the way, it's not beyond our financial capacities. We simply haven't done it. It hasn't been high enough on people's policy agenda. And now, in these circumstances of pandemic, well, we're paying the price of that, not just the individuals directly concerned, but all of us in society. So, I think the only lesson to draw from this is if we want sustainable, safe societies, if we want to move forward together, if we take seriously this notion that we are all in this together, then we simply have to start investing in these areas which have been ones of chronic neglect in the past.
In your role as Director General of the International Labor Organization, do you have the ear of enough heads of government that want to get this right, that want to make some change, that want to be there for their workers?
Look, we bring together governments, employers and workers in this organization. We sit and we talk together. I think many of the subjects of our conversation today have been subjects of conversation for a long time. But we haven't acted upon those conversations. I think there have been very good declarations of intent, but we haven't simply moved to the field of action. And let's hope that in a positive sense, because it's easy to talk about the negative aspects, there will be a before and after to this pandemic. And the after, the new normal, as is frequently talked about, can be a better normal. It can be a better normal in which we do take seriously our obligations to provide universal health care. We do revisit the notion of social contract and fairness, and in so doing ensure the safety and stability of our societies. So I don't think our voices and our thoughts have been followed through into action, and now we have the opportunity, and I trust that we will, to make good on those failings of the past. We are living the circumstances of our past policy failures.
I want to revisit just one thing that you said about the money. The money for these types of things are there. Governments and countries can do what they want. Is it just a matter of them wanting to do it?
Political will is one ingredient, I think, to this story, but it's not the only ingredient, because we hear constantly, don't we, that public budgets are tight, that public spending has to be curtailed. So political will has to go with the means, and often that will require us to revisit some of the basic policy orthodoxies of recent decades. Taxation is the classic case. It's all very well for me to say that the state ought to do A, B, C, and D, needs to invest more in healthcare, in education, and many other things, but they have to have the means to do so. And that means society will have to take some choices about how we tax individuals, how we tax enterprises, how we fund the states, and how we give ourselves the means to achieve our ambitions. And so political will is one thing, but very concrete policy choices have to be made as well.
Guy Ryder, Director General of the International Labour Organization, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
It's been my pleasure.